This is eCollar 201 presented by eCollar Technologies. Myself, Ted Efthymiadis. 2 years ago, we produced a video training series that specifically focused on getting your dog off-leash reliable. It helped thousands of dog owners around the world, but now I'm back to take your eCollar training to the next level. If your dog has been through basic eCollar conditioning, you're ready to get started on these common behavioral problems. In this video series, we're going to cover things like leash pulling, teardrop heel, stay on your bed, how to stop your dog from jumping up on people, how to stop your dog from stealing food from the counters, recalls with distractions, and how to get the perfect eCollar contact on your dog's neck. All right, grab your eCollar Technologies eCollar and let's get right into training. Welcome to eCollar 201 presented by eCollar Technologies and myself, Ted Efthymiadis. If you've not already checked out our previous video series, eCollar 101, please go to ecollar101.com and use the password ILOVEDOGS. It's really important that you take your dog through all of that training because your dog needs to understand the fundamentals of eCollar training. If you just get into it with this DVD series, it's not going to make sense to your dog, and that's not fair to your dog, obviously. So that begs the question, what does your dog need to know to start to progress in their training? Well, in the first series, we really focused on recall training, getting your dog to come when called and getting them off leash. In this series, we're going to work with some behavioral problems more than anything else. So our dogs need to understand the 4 pillars of eCollar training. They are, number 1, where is the tone and the stimulation coming from? Well, we need to teach them that's coming from us ultimately. Number 2, how to turn on the stimulation. They should have already learned that by ignoring our recall command. Number 3, they need to understand obviously how to turn off that stimulation. They're going to do that by complying with our commands. And number 4, they're going to also understand how to avoid that stimulation altogether by complying with our commands and coming back and doing what we want them to do. They don't have to deal with any type of stimulation, and obviously that makes training even more fun. So this leads us to place, or getting your dog to go to the bed and stay there. Within this command, I teach it with almost every one of my clients, and there's a lot of practical applications. So a lot of my clients will use it when they have company over, if their dog's a little bit too excited, they just need a little bit of space for a few minutes, or if the UPS driver is there and they don't want their dog running and barking at the door, or the pizza delivery person, or maybe you're cooking dinner or you've got kids that are eating and dropping food on the ground and you don't want your dog there. You can use it inside the house. You can also use it outside the house. Obviously, I would suggest you start your training inside and then transition outside as the distractions are larger, typically outside when there's animals and people and things like that, different smells that you're competing against. But it's a great command that you will find yourself using a lot, and it's something that ultimately can be simplified from the way that most people train it. So most people train it with a stay command, oftentimes use a hand signal. I don't do any of that stuff. Stay is implied within this command, and of course I'm going to show you how to do that in this next segment. This is Bishop. He's a young German Shepherd, and he really lacks impulse control. So if you're wondering, impulse control is just a dog choosing what we want over what they want. And he really needs this because he's pulling on the leash, he's excessively barking, he's freaking out at people at the door, he's even nipped at a few people. And so his owners are really going to be able to use this command to be able to get him to do the things that they want instead of the things that he wants. As you're following along, you can go to ecollar101.com and print out the homework to make sure that you're doing it step by step the way that things need to be done. So grab some treats, grab your eCollar, your dog, and a bed to train with, and let's get started. Place with Bishop. Getting started, the most important thing that I can do is make it so that he wants to go onto the bed. So as you'll notice, I'm just taking some treats. Of course, I'm using dehydrated liver here, and I'm just simply throwing them on the bed. I'm not expecting him to go onto the bed at this stage. That's really not my concern at this stage. I just want him to go towards the bed, eat off of the bed. Now he's offering 2 feet on the bed, which is good. And so now my expectation is, well, if you'll go 2 feet on, then I want you to go 4 feet on. If you're doing this at home, you're probably doing it on your bed, so your dog might be even more comfortable with doing this. But if you're doing it on a new surface like this, it can be a little bit challenging in the beginning. So we'll go right back to the bed, and we'll see if we can get him all the way on there. And sometimes it takes him a little bit. He's a longer dog, and so it can be a little bit hard for him to go onto the bed. As you'll notice, I'm trying not to allow him to go on sideways here because the bed is just not big enough for him to walk on sideways. He just doesn't have enough body awareness. So again, we're just having him go onto the bed, feeding him when he goes onto the bed. I'm not even asking him to sit at this stage. And then when he goes onto the bed, I feed him and I let him come off the bed after that. It's pretty simple. So he goes on there, I tell him, good boy, here's some food, and I release him. Yes, he gets more food. We're starting to incorporate the sit command now. So basically, I'm just getting him on there, and then I'll ask him to sit. Use my food lure to lure him into the sit a little bit, and then again, releasing him off of the position. So he's doing really nicely. He's very food motivated, which definitely makes things easier. If you're doing this at home, feel free to, you can do this without using treats. You could just do this with your dog's food if you wanted to. A lot of my clients will do it that way. That way they're not giving copious amounts of treats. They just have their dog kind of working for their meal. So he's going onto the bed and he's going into the sit very nicely. Again, he's getting food for going onto the bed. He's getting food for coming off of the bed. So at this stage, we're not even using a command. I'm not telling him place. I'm not doing anything like that yet because he doesn't really know what I want him to do. So traditionally, we're not supposed to, as dog trainers, we're not really supposed to name a command until the dog really is kind of automatically doing it on their own. So traditionally, I won't add a command until the dog is kind of offering the behavior. So as you'll notice here, in a little while, he's going to naturally start going onto the bed. That's when I actually start to use the word place. Now you might be asking yourself, okay, well, when should I be using the command, or why should I be using place as opposed to go to bed or something of that nature? And the reason is because most of my clients, myself included, will have multiple boundary commands. And all that this means is when I tell my dog to go to the place, that means go to the place, and it doesn't matter what the distraction is, I need you to stay there. So stay is implied within this command, and it's really important that you follow it, or else there's going to be consequences. However, when I am giving a command like go to your bed or go lay down, that's actually a much looser boundary command, which just means if I just want my dogs to, I don't know, let's say they're milling around the kitchen and I just don't want them in the kitchen, I might say, hey, go lay down, and that just means you can go to your bed, but if you want to get up after 5 or 10 minutes, I don't care. Place is just a difference in expectations, which just means when I tell you to go to place, it doesn't matter how big the distraction is, you have to follow my command, and you stay there until I release you from the command. So within this command, stay is implied. I don't give a stay command, I don't give a hand signal, it is just implied naturally within the command. So as you had probably seen there, Bishop did struggle a little bit with understanding which way to go on. You probably won't have this as an issue at home, but try to get him to go on the long ways if you have a bed similar to this. Now what I'm starting to do is just finding his low working level. I'm not using it just yet. I'm just finding a level on him. I believe in this session I was probably around the 6 or 7 range on him. He's pretty sensitive to e-collar. And now what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to use my e-collar for getting him to understand that he needs to stay on there. This is the consequence portion. So once he goes on there, if he leaves before I tell him he can leave, then all that I'm doing is I'm holding down my continuous button on my EZ900. As you'll notice, I'm using the red button here, but you can program your buttons differently. So this is just your continuous stimulation if the dog that I'm working with leaves the bed. Now that time he stopped, and so he avoided any stimulation there. You'll notice that I'm doing a lot of feeding him. You know, the reason behind this is because all training is somewhat stressful, and I want the dog that I'm training to know that I'm validating the good choices that they make. So he's on our long line here, and we're starting to add some distraction. So I just threw a treat. There's a treat on the ground there, and he wanted to go for it. So of course I hold my button down this whole time, and I can just let him go there. He's still having to deal with the consequence right now, and I'll walk him back, and I release the pressure right about there. Now, some trainers would suggest that you should not release the stimulation until the dog is not only on the place but sitting. My personal view on this is that I actually just turn it off when the dog goes 4 paws back on. So technically I am setting Bishop up right now, as you'll notice, but I'm teaching him by allowing him to make bad choices, or the choices that I don't want him to make. Now that was a good choice right there. He went back to the bed. He naturally went into a down position. This is a good behavior if you notice your dog doing this. It's a submissive behavior, and usually it means that the dog is starting to figure things out. So I'm just taking him back there, and every time he does what I want, I'll go in and feed him. You'll notice that even here, when he screws up, I'll hold down my button. He screws up, he's dealing with the consequence. I take him back, and I will release the pressure right about there, and you'll also notice that I'm still feeding him. Now, technically speaking, in that scenario, you're not supposed to be feeding them when they screw up. My ethos behind this is that, again, dog training is somewhat stressful, and when a dog is learning in the very beginning, I would much rather reinforce them as many times as I possibly can, and then if I feel like the dog is trying to manipulate me to some degree, taking a correction in order to get the food quicker, then I'll clean that up later on. But that's pretty rare. Most dogs don't do it. As you'll notice, he did pretty well with the treats just being thrown there, and now we're starting to transition into a ball. He's very highly motivated by toys and prey drive and that kind of thing, so a good distraction for him. I've had to increase my level a little bit as we went from very little distraction to adding things like our treats as a distraction, and then adding our ball as a distraction, and as you'll see soon, adding the bike as a distraction. The larger the distraction, the higher level you will need to utilize on your e-collar. Like, that's just plain and simple. There's no way around that. If you go a little bit too high, you can always turn it back down. It's not the end of the world, but he's doing pretty well with it. He's not very dramatic with it, which is really nice. Sometimes shepherds can be a little bit more dramatic and can be a little bit more vocal about not getting their way, but he's staying on there. He's doing what I want. So as you'll notice, when he stays on the bed, there's no consequences. Nothing bad is happening to him. He's still at relatively low levels in the e-collar. I want to say he's probably around the 15, maybe 20 range here right now as I'm opening the door, so not very significant out of 100 levels. I just gently guide him back with the leash, hold down my button, and release it when he goes back on. Of course, we're using a leash here, which is very, very important because he doesn't fully understand what we're doing right now, and if he were to run out the door, yes, I have control via the e-collar, but I would much rather also have a leash to help out. That time I just guided him back, just kind of walked into him and used my body language, but it's very critical that you use a leash or a long line at least for the first couple of days until the dog is really getting it and is very responsive and knows how to go back essentially on their own. You'll know it's time to make that transition when, if you hold down that button, the dog runs back to the bed on their own. That's typically what we look for. So I'm just using the bike. He's got a high prey drive. And so I figured that would be a good distraction for him. You might not want to go to this level of distraction in your first lesson. You'll be practicing a couple times a day for at least a week or two, and so you can go a lot slower than this. But because I've done this lesson thousands of times with thousands of dogs, I tend to progress pretty quickly. So he's doing really well. He made that one little screw up, took a small correction there, went right back, and as you can see, he is doing great. So be patient with your dog, take your time, and they will do really, really well. Now, just letting him come off, having a little party, letting him know he's done a good job, and always do that with your dogs. It's the most important part. Leash walking is always the third thing that I teach my clients' dogs after recall and place, because all of the fundamentals are there to be able to get our dogs to walk nicely on the leash. They already understand how to turn on the stimulation, how to turn off the stimulation, and so we just extend that to our leash walking. In essence, all that we're doing is showing our dogs that if they start to pull, the pressure turns on. If they stop pulling, the pressure turns off. And if they never pull, of course, the pressure never happens. You know, over the years, I've gotten a little bit more relaxed about what I expect of my clients' dogs on a leash walk. I don't really care if the dog is a little bit ahead or a little bit behind or off to the side. The fundamentals are, I just don't want you pulling on the leash, because that obviously is annoying and could hurt somebody's back, or they could slip and fall. And I don't want you reacting towards other dogs, people, things like that. You might be asking yourself, do I use a leash? Do I use a slip lead? Do I use a prong collar? Do I use a... What am I using? It doesn't matter what collar or leash you have on your dog. The e-collar is going to be the power steering, and whatever collar and device that you're using as a leash is just going to be what's attaching you to your dogs. Grab some treats, grab your dog, leash and collar, and your e-collar. Let's get started. Back with Bishop. As you can see, he likes to pull on the leash. Right now, he is trying to sniff out a chipmunk or a squirrel, and he really likes to pull on the leash. So obviously a major concern for his owners, especially because his mother is pregnant, and so that's obviously a large concern because she wants to be able to walk him and not worry about taking the baby out with a stroller. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just finding kind of a low level on Bishop, and essentially I'm just starting at 0 and slowly working my way up. And if he puts on the brakes and doesn't want to go anywhere, with him, I'm just holding down my continuous stimulation. Every time he puts on the brakes like that, I'm holding it down. You may have the opposite problem. You may have the problem that your dog is just constantly moving forward and pulling on the leash. That's actually a lot more typical than a dog that's slowing down like this. But basically, I'm just holding down my continuous stimulation button, and then I'm releasing it when he starts to come in the direction that I want. So if I'm adding pressure right now, we'll wait for it, we'll keep that pressure on, keep that pressure on, keep that pressure on, and we'll release it right about there. So we're just showing him that if he puts on the brakes or if he starts to pull on the leash, like right there, we will add a little bit of pressure. So as you'll notice, I'm not hyper fixated on should the dog be on the left-hand side, should the dog be on the right-hand side. That really doesn't matter to me. As well, I honestly don't worry or care about is the dog a little bit ahead or is the dog a little bit behind. As you'll notice there, we've got to give him the stimulation to get him moving. But I don't care about the little particulars right now, because what I'm trying to achieve is I'm trying to get him to understand that he's got to walk within a certain buffer of us. And then he can't be just stopping or pulling at his own leisure. So this is really, really critical. As he sees a bird there, he gets kind of heightened and his tail starts to go up. Maybe the same thing will happen with your dog. But essentially all that we're doing is we're saying, hey, stay within our bubble and you can avoid all stimulation. You'll probably notice too that I'm not really using any food here, nor is his owner. That's really not something that we're hyper focused on. As you'll see, the car goes by and he gets a little bit heightened there. He's very reactive towards cars. That was actually a really good repetition for him. But he's also with bikes and dogs and cats and all these kinds of animals. So he's very, very reactive towards all moving things, which oftentimes you do see with German Shepherds. But one of the things that's really important to note is, again, we're not hyper focused on the little bits right now. That really doesn't matter. If you want to have your dog be in a very specific position on your left-hand side, for example, like a lot of people, then you can do that, and you can do that a little bit later. The important piece is starting nice and low on your e-collar level, using your continuous stimulation, and increasing it until you start to get the response that you want. That's really what is going to move the needle here. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not really focused on using food here, just because that's another thing for the owner to have to do. Now, if it were just me being a professional trainer, I might go ahead and do that. But given that it's the owner and he's not even using the e-collar right now, I'm actually in control of the e-collar. This is something that obviously they have taken home and they're doing with their homework. But I just wanted them to be able to just hold on to the leash and not even really have to worry about the e-collar or the level or anything like that. So the levels in the beginning would have been rather low, and we've had to increase as the lesson has went on. So in the beginning, we would have started out, found a level on him probably around a 10 or so. At this stage, he would be probably in the 25 to 30 range just walking down the road. So of course, this is a pretty significant jump in e-collar stimulation for Bishop. But you have to remember that when you go outside, the level of distraction is just naturally going to be so much higher that it just will increase. Their increased pain threshold is naturally going to happen because just being outside is super arousing. So keep that in mind. If your dog works at a relatively low level inside, it's not uncommon for your dog to start to increase in those levels. I have actually seen dogs that work in the 5 to 10 range inside. I've seen dogs need the 80s and 90s even outside. Now, most of those dogs will come down dramatically as the weeks progress, but it's not uncommon to see dogs like him be in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s just for walking down the road. It depends, of course, the collar receiver that you have on, you know, whether you have a smaller 090 receiver or if you have a larger receiver. This guy's actually on a larger RX 120 receiver, and so naturally it's going to be a little bit more stimulation for him, so we're working him a little bit lower. As you can see, when that car went by, I gave him a little tap. He corrected his course. We're just walking by the stop sign here, essentially just because I like to use stop signs and meeting places for dogs where they like to pee as a distraction. He walked up, he kind of slowly got to the end of the leash, and then he started to walk with mom. Now, of course, he gets overstimulated by a truck. I hold down my button for a few seconds, and it keeps him a little bit calmer. He doesn't do perfectly, but he does a lot better than if I hadn't have done anything. Now, this may not be a problem that you have with your dog, but you may have similar issues with your dog getting overly stimulated when other dogs go by, etc. So just keep in mind that we have two things that we're working on here. We are focusing on getting our dogs to not pull on the leash or stay behind and kind of drag their feet too much. And then a lot of the dogs that I work with, I'm also focusing on making sure that they're not reacting towards people, dogs, cats, those types of things, because that is very, very common, especially for the dogs that I work with. So now he's starting to follow along a little bit better. He's going off. Oh, stops to have a poopy time. Now, this is a good point to make, is that you're going to have to kind of stop and let your dog use the bathroom at certain times. This was really weird. We came across a little chipmunk. I had to increase his level here because I didn't want him to try to eat the chipmunk. But this, unfortunately, this little chipmunk had been hit by a car, and we were going to use that as a distraction. I had to go up to about 35, maybe 40 on that in the first repetition. The second time, I tapped it just at about 30, and he walked right past it. And so he kind of took the hint. He even did vocalize a little bit there on that first repetition. It seemed to have taught him a pretty good lesson, and he did really well. Now I'm changing my technique just a little bit. I just made a quick stop there, and as I stop, I'm holding my button down or just tapping it really quickly when he hits the end of the leash. This is a different technique. I call this just a stop and pop, and essentially I'm not really using the leash to correct him. I'm just stopping quickly, and I'm using the e-collar to correct him. You typically want to be at a little bit higher level when you do this. So for him right now, he's at about a 35. And this just helps if your dog is not hyper-focused on you. So that was a much better repetition there. If your dog is not focusing on where you're at, it's a really good solution because it kind of makes them focus on you. And now he's following along a lot better. All right, so here we are with Mishka. Mishka is a husky, as you can see. Huskies, of course, known for their abilities and their genetic propensities to pull on the leash, which you can see she's doing right now. Of course, I'm starting out the same way that I did with Bishop. I'm just holding down my continuous stimulation when she starts to pull and releasing it when she stops pulling. So, very, very simple, just like we had done with Bishop. And she is, as you can see, pretty distracted by certain things. She's not nearly as bad as some of the Huskies that I've worked with, but she definitely is off in her own little world. She lives a little bit outside. She lives kind of in the country in a more rural setting, so she's got a little bit more room to kind of meander and kind of go off. And so for her, this is a really big deal, being in the city, being in an area where there's more distractions. As you can see there, she reacted a little bit negatively to the e-collar, and that's okay. I'm just going to turn my level down a few. With her, she works a little bit higher on the e-collar, so she would have started out about 21, I believe, and now she would be in the about 30 range. So we went up pretty rapidly with her just because she does have a higher pain threshold, and that's just part of who she is. Some dogs, you don't ever have to go over like a 5 maybe or a 10. Some dogs are very, very sensitive. If you watch the e-collar 101 DVD series, we had a dog, Sasha, in that series who was very similar to this dog, but she was a lot softer, and I don't remember ever going over maybe a 7 or an 8 with that dog. And she was just very sensitive and very submissive. Whereas this dog has a different temperament, and she's a little bit more apt to kind of go in and doing her own thing. So we're just keeping on her, making sure that as she is pulling, we are holding down our red continuous button. Now, it may be programmed differently on your remote, but very similar technique to what we were doing with Bishop. As you can see, she's making a lot of infractions, and unfortunately, she's having to deal with the consequences. So rather than using my first approach, just using a longer, lower level of stimulation, what I'm doing with her now is I just tried a couple situations where I would just stop and give her a correction when she hit the end of the leash, like I'm doing here. Some dogs thrive with this technique. Some dogs actually much prefer a different solution. Now, we've got some dogs that are walking by here. This is my neighbor, who is a friend of mine who does a lot of dog rescue, and she's walking her dogs. So I didn't want Mishka to get too excited. She has a history of barking and carrying on around other dogs and pulling and whatnot. So I did give her a couple of corrections as she was focusing on the other dogs. You might be wondering, okay, well, wait a second. If I use the e-collar around other dogs, isn't that counterproductive? Couldn't that actually make things worse or develop a negative association towards other dogs? It's really not how that goes. Dogs understand what the infraction is for, And if she understands that she's pulling on the leash, or she's getting heightened and she's starting to whine, or she's starting to bark at another dog, dogs are fully capable of understanding, well, my behavior actually turned on that stimulation. It's not that the other dog did that, and so they don't develop a negative association. So here we are, right back to where the squirrel is, and she's done actually really well. She went towards it. She only had to go to about a 30, and now she's just kind of leaving it alone. And of course, giving her a treat here too. Always feel free to do that if you want to. But as I said in the previous segment, if you're more comfortable just working with the e-collar, that's really something that's going to move the needle a lot more than using your food. So if you need to focus on one thing and one thing only, holding your leash using your e-collar is probably a better thing to spend your time focusing on until you start to make some really good headway with your dog. Now she's walking really, really nicely, partially because the training is working, and honestly, partially because she's getting a little bit more tired. Right now, I'm just talking a little bit about with the client how when you hold the leash really close, that can actually be very bad for your leash walking because dogs naturally have what we call an opposition reflex. And so I traditionally like to give them a little bit more room on the leash. Now, of course, if your dog is super dangerous and there's people walking by your dogs, you don't want to do that. But just keep it in mind. And of course, as always, be calm, be patient with your dog, give them time to figure it out. Start nice and low on your e-collar, increase as you need to, and of course, if your dog is doing it really well, you can always decrease too. Jumping up is one of the most common behavioral problems that I work on with my clients every single day, and your dog might be doing the same thing. So it's actually really simple to fix with e-collar training if you do it the right way. And of course, I'm going to show you that in this segment here with a dog named Bronx, who actually lives just across the street from me. He's a really cool dog, but he's got some behavior problems that I'm helping his owner with. The thing that you want to remember about jumping up and fixing that with e-collar is that ultimately you don't want to use any commands. Don't tell your dog no jumping up or anything like that, and here's the reason why. I always say that good dog training works if the client is there, but great dog training works even if the client is not there. So all that this means is we don't want our dog running to the front door if your mother or father or friend walks in and you're in the bathroom and the dog looks around as if to say, well, there's nobody here to get me in trouble, I guess I can jump up on them. So ultimately, we want our dog to think that the act of jumping up on somebody turned on the stimulation. The act of doing the opposite of that, getting down, turned off the stimulation. So, grab your dog, grab your e-collar, grab some treats, call your buddies over or order some pizza. Let's get started with our training. Here we are with Bronx. He's a cute little guy, but as cute as he does love jumping up. So we're addressing that today for him and his owner. As you'll notice, I'm walking through the door right now with my friend Justin, who's a fellow trainer. And all that I'm doing is I'm holding down my continuous stimulation every time he starts to jump up on one of us. So I'm just starting at a nice low level because we don't want to scare him. We don't want it to be anything that's too negative for him. He's starting to understand what we're doing. And when he doesn't jump up, we're throwing treats on the ground. Now, if you are going to feed the dog from your hand, make sure that your hands are relatively low because you don't want to, by accident, let them know that they should be jumping up. Because if you have your hands too high, oftentimes they'll jump up in order to get them. So we're just dropping treats on the ground to let him know, hey, good job, you did what we wanted. So little jumps here, these are also being corrected because, he's kind of forgetting and he's trying it again and again and again. But we're just using pretty low levels here. I want to say he's about level 8 on the e-collar out of 100, and this is on the micro unit, so it's a very small one. And as you'll notice there, I didn't do anything. I just let him jump up, held down the button, and then when he stops, we're giving him food. So we're just going to do this until he figures out what we're looking for. And if he's really not getting it, we can increase our level a little bit and get a little bit more power steering on him so that he makes a better choice. So as we go outside, we'll set up another scenario for him and we'll see how he does on this repetition. Usually it only takes a few repetitions, and perfectly on the third repetition, he came, didn't jump up, he got the treat. Now you still have to watch most dogs, because if you give them the opportunity, when you walk away, they will still jump on you. But that's the greatness of the e-collar, is that even if that does happen, it really doesn't matter, because you can hit the button from wherever you are. So again, keep it fun. Make sure that there is consequences to jumping up, but don't go too high, because we don't want to scare our dogs here. And if you are going to feed the dogs from your hands, make sure that you keep your hands low. Another very common behavioral problem that we deal with all the time as trainers is dogs jumping up on the counters and stealing food. Good news for you guys, it's actually very... And of course, nobody wants their dogs doing this because, well, it's food that they shouldn't be eating, but it's actually really dangerous, and dogs have died from eating, large amounts of food and their stomachs twisting and whatnot. So it's really important that we get our dogs figured out in this way. You're gonna need a few things. Of course, you're gonna need your e-collar, you're gonna need 2 spoons, and you're gonna need some sort of a camera device, whether it be a couple cell phones or tablets, or maybe a baby monitor, a video baby monitor that you might have access to. All right, so in our training, you gotta remember that if you have more than one dog, you have to isolate them so that you can do just one dog at a time. All right, grab all the stuff that you need. Let's get started on our training. We're back with Bronx, the cutie patootie. We're setting up a few spoons here, and as you'll notice, we have 2 spoons just counterbalancing, and we've got some meat on there. So all that we're doing here is setting up a scenario so that we can go into a different room and we can wait until we hear one of the spoons hit the floor. That way we will know when we have to correct our dog. So Bronx has his e-collar on. He's gonna smell the meat from the other room, thinks he's going to get away with it because there's nobody in the room, at which point we will give him a correction. I like to use a higher level correction, so for him I'm using a 30 out of 100, and he only needed this for 2 repetitions, and he learned very quickly and is doing really well with this training. So it's pretty simple. If you want to use a camera, that's also a great way to go about your training. The teardrop heel is essentially just a finishing position for the heel position. All that this means is when we ask our dogs to come to us and to heel, we want them to flip into a position. And the reason we call it a teardrop heel is because we're using a food lure in the shape of a teardrop, like this. So, grab some treats, let's get started. Teardrop heel with Sadie. This is one of my favorite dogs I've trained in a long time, and I think you'll find out why in just a moment here. So I start by putting my food lure out, calling her to me, and then I move my hand in a teardrop position up to get the sit, feed her, and release her, have her go right back into the place. Now, she's very food motivated and loves to learn. So as you'll notice, I've got to be pretty quick about how I do this, and your dog might be a lot slower, and so that's okay. It's really important to note that as you're training this, you want to use a place to keep the dog stationary, and I like to step back about 5 steps, keep my right foot planted, and then I'll move back a good stride with my left foot, and then I'll bring it up as the dog comes into the position that I want them to come into. So let's watch this one more time here. I'll keep my right foot planted. I'm adding a little bit of distance now because she's doing really well. Call her to me, and then the leg goes up again, and I feed her, and she goes right back. That's essentially it. When you want to take this to the next level, then you just take the long line off and you're good to go. So here we are with Gunner. Gunner, as you can see, is a little bit apprehensive about going on this place. Now, it's just because he's in a new environment and this is a new bed for him. So he's a little bit apprehensive, and that's okay. So I'm taking a little bit of time to show him what I want him to do because he's a little bit slower than Sadie. So I lure him, left foot back, left foot forward. I get that teardrop position, go up a little bit, get the sit, give him the food, and then I release him. Now he just wants to play, so I've got to give him a little bit of praise and have him go back onto the bed. Again, he's still a little bit apprehensive, so I'm just taking a little bit more time to make sure that he is going to be confident. So let's do another repetition with here. He's sitting nicely on the place. I'll take about 5 steps back, and I'll put my food lure out. I'll call him to me. I'll plant that foot, and then I'll do my teardrop, feed him when he's in position, and have him go right back onto the place. So he's doing much better now. He's doing a really good job. As I said previously, the last transition is just to take the leash off. If the dog is doing really well with it, I could probably get away with doing that with both of these dogs at this stage. With them, I would also suggest that, of course, it's not just about taking the leash off. We also have to add a command here. So I don't like to add a new command, until the dog is just kind of naturally doing it on their own. As you'll go through in the homework that's applied with this series, I typically like to do about 3 to 4 days without adding the command when I'm doing teardrop heel, and then I will add it, and then maybe a few more days, and then I will get rid of the leash, and then you should be good to go. If you do need to use your e-collar, you only have to use your e-collar if your dog is very distracted. We're not using the e-collar here to teach the dog anything. That's being done with the food. If you want to transition away from the food, that's okay. I have no problem with that. Believe me, my dogs don't get treats every 5 seconds. They get very few treats. But at the end of the day, when you're teaching a dog something, you want to make it fun for them. And that is really my goal here. If you need to use a little bit of pressure to keep your dog on focusing on where you need them to, don't do that until your dog is very fluent in what you're asking them to do. Having a 100% recall on your dog is paramount if you're going to let your dog off leash. I always say that it's pretty easy to get about 95% recall on your dog with e-collar training. The problem is there's that extra 5% that could get your dog into a lot of trouble. Whether your dog runs after a porcupine or a skunk or a deer, or doesn't come when called if they see somebody playing fetch with their dog and they want to run over there and steal the toy, or they see a cat that they want to chase, something of that nature. And so that's what this little segment is all about, using high-level distractions and getting our dogs to come to us when we ask them to, regardless of the level of distractions. So grab your dog, grab some treats, your e-collar, and heck, if you've got access to some animals, get those too. "100% recall." As you can see, we've got some great distractions here. Chickens being a great distraction when you're working with dogs. A lot of the dogs that I work with have issues around animals, whether they be chickens or squirrels or ducks. And Roman is that kind of dog. He's a very high pain threshold and a very high prey drive. And so I've got him on a long line, and I'm just allowing him to go near the chickens. And ultimately all that I'm doing is I'm starting low on my e-collar, and I'm holding down the continuous when he starts to run towards the chickens. I'm increasing that level until he stops. Now, just a few seconds there, he gave out a little bit of a vocalization. He turned right around and started to come towards me. Now, he's starting to smarten up here a little bit, where he's being a lot more cautious around the chickens. This is one of the areas where I highly suggest, if your dog is capable of killing animals, don't be afraid to go a little higher on your e-collar, another vocalization there, because it's much better to be a little higher than a little bit too low. Now, as you'll see, he's a little bit apprehensive here, and that's okay. because again, we're dealing with a potentially life-changing, life-altering scenario here. If we don't put enough pressure on him and he's not being very specifically focused on staying away from those distractions, he could chase a horse and get hit by a car. He could do any number of different things. And so I wouldn't worry about your level so much here. Start low, but don't be afraid to turn that e-collar up as you need to, because it's really important that they know there's going to be significant consequences if they make a bad choice. So here we are with Sadie. Sadie doesn't know what the heck to do with these chickens. She almost looks like she wants to play with them. So being a border collie, you'd think she'd be even more focused and wanting to run after them. But it seems like she's just more focused on just wanting to play. And so I'm being cognizant of that with my e-collar level. With Roman, he was up to the 70s and 80s to get him to stop wanting to chase the chickens. With Sadie, I'm only in, I want to say, the 15 to 20 range. She's not needing a whole lot, so obviously I'm not using a whole lot here. All that I'm doing is if she goes too close to the chickens, I'm just holding down the stimulation, and obviously she would be pulling on the leash at that exact same point. So she's a little bit more skeptical. I wouldn't suggest that she would necessarily be the kind of dog that would want to kill another animal, so not as important or as pertinent for her. But as you can see, she doesn't know exactly what to do. So not as important for her as it would be for a dog like Roman. So of course, I'm going to work at lower levels here. Of course, anytime you're adding distractions like this, you always want to go back to your long line, at least for a session or two, until your dogs are doing things the way that you want. If you want to use treats here, you can. There's obviously nothing wrong with doing that. When proofing stock and herding situations, I typically don't use a lot of food because the situation is so arousing that I don't find that I need to be giving them positive reinforcement, because directly after a correction, they're naturally, their prey drive and their enthusiasm and their interest in the world just gets their confidence to come up so quickly. So a little bit of praise goes a long way here. Just to end off with saying this, don't be afraid to go too high if your dog really, really needs it. If your dog is potentially going to kill something, don't be afraid to turn your e-collar up and let them know that that is absolutely not okay. Hey guys, Ted Efthymiadis here for e-collar Technologies. Today we're going to unpack getting a good connection on your dog's neck with your e-collar Technologies e-collar. It's not as easy as it seems. With some breeds, with certain types of coats, it can be very, very challenging. And getting a consistent connection on your dog's neck is vital when you're training your dog. I know this sounds silly, but you always want to start by making sure that you've turned on your collar and your remote. I've been in so many lessons over the years where people forgot to turn on their collar and they thought it was an inconsistency issue or it wasn't getting good connection or something like that. And it was just because they forgot to turn on the collar. Okay, let's get started. We want to remember that your e-collar has to be on snug, not extremely tight and not loose. We don't want it jingling around on their neck or anything like that. Remember that a dog's neck is shaped like a traffic cone. So it's bigger at the base than it is at the top. That's really important because if you put it down here at the base, it will oftentimes move its way up as your dog is swimming or rolling around, anything like that. And you want to remember that if that happens, it's going to be really inconsistent by the time it works its way up. So we want to put it nice and high on the dog's neck. I always suggest anywhere in the front is fine or on the bottom. So the left, the right, or the middle of their neck. And you want to get it on snug enough to where you can just fit a couple of fingers in between their neck and the collar. Now you want to remember that you do not want to attach a leash to your collar. Of course, it does come with a supply D-ring, so a lot of people want to attach their leash right here. But you don't want to do that because if that happens, if your dog pulls, all the pressure is going to be on those two little contact points, which is not going to be super comfortable for your dog. Rather, just a tightly fitted normal buckle collar is fine, or a martingale collar is my preferred collar of choice. Even a harness is perfectly fine for training. If you're having issues getting a good connection on your dog's neck with the e-collar, one of the things that you want to do is start by making sure that you use a good quality de-shedding tool like a Furminator. That's my tool of choice personally, and just go all around their neck, making sure that you get rid of any extra undercoat that could be getting in between your contact points and your dog's skin. It's absolutely critical that you are using the right contact points on your e-collar, depending on the dog that you're working with. So that's one of the things I love so much about e-collar technologies is you've got this wide array of contact points. I train so many different types of dogs with different types of coats. I need different contact points available. So let's get started. These really short ones are available for dogs that have almost no fur. Some of the bully breeds that I work with are most notable as far as that's concerned. If you've got a dog that is going to need their e-collar on for any more than, let's say, 4 hours, it's advisable to use what we call a contact pad. And all that this does is it spreads the stimulation that the e-collar provides over multiple contacts, so 4 instead of 2, and it just means that your dog can wear their e-collar a little bit longer. This is available in short dog or short-haired version and also a long-haired version. Now, these ones here are 1/2 inch in length, and these are great. They're gonna come right in your box with your e-collar technologies unit, and it's going to be great for most dogs. I'm not gonna go through all the different breeds, but most dogs, a lot of Labrador retrievers can get away with using those. And just a medium coat is typically what you're gonna use, just the standard ones there. A lot of Rottweilers I'll use, sometimes Dobermans and whatnot. Now, going a little bit longer here, we've got 3/4 of an inch, and these ones also come in the box. So the black ones are gonna come in the box with your unit. A lot of times I'll use these on German Shepherds. I'll use them also on Golden Retrievers where they tend to have a little bit longer coat. This is a good option right out of the box. If you've got a dog who has a much thicker coat, like a Husky, a Malamute, St. Bernard, something like that, you probably want to go with something more like this. This is the 3/4 inch thick-haired version. This is a contact point that I use all the time for a lot of the dogs that I work with because a lot of them have a very thick undercoat, like I said. Even some of the German Shepherds that I work with, I will use these because they have a little ball on the end that helps to seat under the undercoat. Now these are the 1-inch version. I honestly have not found these to be super beneficial, even though they are longer. So with very thick, long coats, I will typically start with the 3/4 inch thick-haired. If that is absolutely not working, I've got another alternative. These are Extreme Ultra Wings, and these are one of the coolest things that have ever come out in e-collar training. What happens is these little contact points help to seat under the undercoat. And this particular model is made out of titanium, so it's fully waterproof, which is really good. And you can typically leave these on your dog a little bit longer. But like I said, if you've got a really thick coat, you want to go with either these ones or the wings to get really good contact on your dog's neck. If you've got the right contact points on your e-collar, maybe you've got set up where you've got the RX090, which is provided with most e-collar technologies units. Sometimes what I'll do to help to seat under undercoat is I'll actually upgrade right off the get-go to the RX120. This one has a little bit more power, but oftentimes that's not why I use it. This one has a little bit more weight, and I find just the added weight going from this one to this one can actually be really helpful if you've got a really thick-coated dog. Another thing you can try if you're having a hard time getting a good consistent contact on your dog's neck is using the bungee collars that e-collar technology sells. So they're available in a 3/4 inch and a 1 inch, and these are really helpful if you want to get a better consistent contact on your dog's neck because they will stretch out. And honestly, it's just easier to put your e-collar on and know that it's going to get a nice, appropriate, snug fit. All right, let's go through a quick checklist here. So if you're having problems getting a good connection on your dog's neck, few things that you want to check. Have you turned on your collar and your remote? I know it's really simple, but a lot of times that gets pushed away and people forget. Now, Do you have the right contact points on for your dog's coat? Very, very important. I can't stress this enough. If you're not getting good contact, invest a few dollars into getting the right contact points. That'd be the first thing that I would try. Another thing you can do is use a Furminator. If your dog's got a double coat, get as much of that undercoat as you possibly can. You could also invest in a bungee collar, which will help to get the right accurate fit on your dog's neck with your e-collar. And another thing is too, if you've tried everything else, you might want to look at upgrading to the RX 120 receiver if you're really having a hard time, because this has a little extra weight and that can help to seat under really thick coated conditions. I can't stress how important it is to remind my clients that when they're using an e-collar, they should try to rotate it every couple hours of use. Now, in full transparency, most of my clients don't use their e-collar for more than a few hours. They take their dog out for a walk or go swimming with their dog, and it's not on for all that long. But if your dog needs to be wearing the e-collar inside your house or out in the yard for any more than a few hours, I suggest that you loosen it up, move it to another side of their neck just to prevent any possible irritation. Now that you know absolutely everything about getting a good connection on your dog's neck with the e-collar, get out there, have some fun training your dog. This has been eCollar 201 presented by eCollar Technologies. I want to personally thank you for watching this video series and remind you to take your time while training your dog. Surely e-collar training is a lot quicker than most styles of dog training, right? It just is. And that's one of the biggest benefits to e-collar training. But you have to remember that it is essential that we show our dogs step by step, methodically, all the way through the process, because that's only fair. Never be afraid to take a few steps back if you're concerned that your dog is not understanding. Never be afraid to go back to a long leash if you're concerned that your dog is not understanding. Never be afraid to reach out to a trainer that might be able to help you with something if you or your dog is not understanding. So again, thank you so much for watching this series. Go to the website ecollar101.com, print out your detailed homework so that you can do a great job with your dog.